Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the conference. It's difficult to believe that we've got here already, but we have. It's a great pleasure to introduce our final plenary speaker, who is David Goodhew, as you can see on the screen here. For the last 2 years, he has been a visiting fellow of St John's College in Durham University and is currently vicar of St Barnabas Church, Middlesbrough, which is where you're speaking to us from, you've just told us. Prior to that, David taught at Cranmer Hall, which of course is part of St John's College in Durham, for 11 years. He's written widely on modern British church history and also modern South African history. And most recently, he has co-edited for Routledge the volume entitled The Desecularisation of the City, London's Churches 1980 to the Present. And he's currently editing, with Mark Smith, who is well known to us here, the volume Christianity in Britain since 1914. Now, I met David first at the EHS conference in Edinburgh, and David had been giving a paper, and I introduced myself in the lunch queue. And the upshot of that was I had a kind of light bulb moment about the need for historians to really get to grips, not only with very modern church history, but also to be aware of the way in which the churches have been very significantly reconfigured in the last decade or so, something which actually came home to me quite forcibly when I went back to working in England and started hanging around in Nottingham on a Sunday and just seeing how, you know, that the huge churches basically do not belong to the traditional denominations that I'd spent my weekdays teaching students about. And David also, as a result of that conversation in the lunch queue, very kindly sent me one of the reports that he'd written with a colleague called New Churches in the Northeast. And I've used it with undergraduates as a seminar text. I used it quite extensively and they absolutely loved it. It really resonated with something they could understand. And the light bulb moment really was wanting to have David at this conference to talk to us about really, really modern church history and what we as ecclesiastical historians of one sort or another need to consider in relation to that. So it's a great pleasure to welcome David, and his title is Contemporary Church History, New Churches and Baptism in Britain, 1980 to the Present.
Francis, thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you to you and Elizabeth for all the work you've done for this conference. I am in awe of your resolution in keeping this EHS going in the pandemic. Let me screen share. Actually, just before that, let me just say that what I'm, as Francis says, what I'm going to do is resolutely uber modern. Please don't hear me as engaging in the kind of chronological snobbery, which is characteristic of our times. One of the joys for me of coming to EHS is to learn about church history from the whole range of the last 2,000 years. But I do think there's something particular to learn about the most recent decades. And if I can share this with you, I hope will understand what drives that feeling. This is a list of new churches in the London borough of Newham. It was created by Dr. Colin Marchant. New is defined as since between 1975 and 2015. And there are over 350 churches named on this list. It's a quite extraordinary ecclesial cornucopia. what I'm going to do in this paper is explore baptism in churches like this since 1980. But in order to do so, I want to spend some time exploring the nature of such new churches. They remain remarkably ill understood, and their history largely unknown. I also want to reflect with you on the practice of trying to write church history of the recent past, contemporary church history, as one might call it. Now, a list like that raises all kinds of questions. And again, let me just share a few that one might consider. Whoops, I'm on the wrong slide here. There we go. Firstly, what is a new church? How strong is this data? Can we believe it? And is this phenomenon, given that Newham covers part of East London, one of the most diverse places on the planet, is this phenomenon, as a professor of one of Britain's top universities once told me, a reflection of the fact that London is just another planet, irrelevant to everywhere else? Is this just a reflection of migration and the burgeoning population of London, at least pre-COVID? Are these congregations like fireworks that shoot spectacularly upwards but rapidly fizzle out? And more generally, what is the nature of these churches, and how does their trajectory compare to that of the historic denominations? What is clear is that these churches are baptizing. But unless we answer those questions I've just mentioned and a few others, we can't begin to make sense of what the advent of new churches means for baptism in the recent past. So then, what is a new church? Well, without going into tedious detail, I mean simply a church that you couldn't have gone to prior to, say, 1975, in the case of that Newham study, because they weren't there. That is to say, it's new. In some cases, such congregations may occupy the premises of an existing congregation, but meet at a different time. In some cases, one congregation has effectively died out and a new congregation come into being. And now, precise definition of what is a new church is a judgment call, and different people will make the call differently. But however defined, the overwhelming majority of churches on that list I just showed you are new. The Newham data was published in a chapter by Colin Marchant in a book I co-edited, The Desecularization of the City, which came out in 2019. I am necessarily biased, but I think that list of new churches is worth the price of the book alone. Now, how strong is the data? You'll have to read the research to make your own judgment on that question, but the short answer I would give is it's robust. There's a very wide range of other research which shows the ecclesial vitality of East London. And there is a great deal of data showing similar phenomena across much of London. The work of Andrew Rogers on the borough of Southwark being a particularly good example. Is this just an example of hyper-diverse areas? Well, in some ways, yes. Certainly what's happening in East London is not being replicated in, say, Devon or Cumbria. But we need to beware downplaying it. Newham is only one of 32 London boroughs, and the Newham experience is happening across a good deal of London. And the work of Anthony Paul Cooper analysing social media indicates that current research continues to undercount the actual number of new congregations in the capital. Using very innovative analysis of Twitter feeds, Cooper found a good number of churches which are simply not have hitherto been invisible to researchers. Is this ecclesial energy, is it simply just due to migration? Well, certainly migration is a fundamental driver, and you can see that from the names on that list from Newham, an extraordinary range of nationalities present. But I think we need to be careful when we emphasize migration. If someone were to argue that the growth of Muslim Britain was just due to migration, I think we would be rightly uneasy about the word just in that sentence. Similarly, the importance of migration in new church proliferation is not a reason to downplay it. Studies of Glasgow and the northeast of England, which I will look at later, and which are very different demographically to East London, show substantial numbers of new congregations, some of them propelled by migration, but many being moved forward by other dynamics. London is different to much of the UK, but we can overstate that difference. The ethnic diversification of London that has happened in recent decades is to be found in all larger cities. It's spilling out across much of southern England and beyond. Rather than being another planet, the capital has been, in terms of demographic change, a harbinger of the future for large chunks of the UK. There is a growing range of research that suggests new churches are widespread across the UK. Now let me find my PowerPoint again. Here, and forgive me, it may be a little bit small to read. Here's a chunk of the research report, New Churches in the Northeast, that Francis mentioned, which was published in 2015. It showed that 125 new congregations had been started in the northeast of England since 1980. Sheila Akomia-Conte's, sorry, just before to go on to the next bit of information, worth saying that of these northeastern new churches, they were primarily centred in Newcastle, in Durham City and Teesside, but they were to be found elsewhere. And if you can make out the smallness of the print, you can see that from this list here. The researcher Sheila Akomia-Conte has written an excellent PhD through Aberdeen, which surveyed new congregations in Glasgow between 2000 and 2016. Again, like the northeast of England, here is an area which is very different to London, which has shared much less of the economic dynamism of the capital in recent decades, less of its demographic fluidity, and which, like the rest of Scotland, has been something of a leader in secularization in the UK in recent decades. Sheila Akomia-Conte's PhD, as I said, surveyed Glasgow from 2000 to 2016. She found 110 new congregations had been started in Glasgow in that period. That research into Glasgow and Northeast matters because it shows how new churches are very far from simply the preserve of hyper-diverse areas like East London, being found in areas less ethnically mixed, less economically dynamic, and areas rapidly secularizing by other metrics. New churches are to be found across urban Britain, from Hackney to Hartlepool, Kensington to Clydebank. They are markedly rarer in rural areas, but it's important to remember how urban a country the UK is. The government classes less than 20% of the UK population as now living in rural areas. Are these congregations like fireworks that shoot spectacularly upwards but rapidly fizzle out? Well, there are 4 studies that address that topic, that by Colin Marchant regarding Newham, but also other surveys of churches in the Northeast, in York, and Peter Brierley's work on London. They look at the rate of new church attrition, the extent to which new churches open, but then after a few years close. These studies found that somewhere between 10 and 20% of those new churches that start subsequently close. Now that's significant, but rather less significant than the fact that the large majority of new churches had stayed open once they started. These are mostly not ecclesial ephemera. A good number of such new churches start and remain small, but others grow significantly, and some are very substantial entities indeed. What generally can we say about these new churches? How does their trajectory compare to that of the historic congregations? Well, you can't read everything off from about the new churches of Newham by their names, but I think the broad impression which that laundry list of names gives rise is not misleading. The vast majority are not from the historic denominations. Migration into the UK in recent decades is a key driver, though there are other drivers. The bulk of new churches could loosely be categorized in terms of tradition as evangelical charismatic. But there are a good many other dynamics. One might note the rise of Orthodox congregations. And there are some new congregations being started by the historic denominations, though not many, and some of the historic denominations are more active than others in so doing. And of course, there have been a large number of churches closed by the historic denominations in the same period. In Newham, in 1975, there were 81 congregations from the historic denominations. By 2015, their number had fallen to 68. Now, we certainly can't read Newham off as the model for how ecclesial life is changing nationally, but neither should we ignore it. Let me say a bit about thinking about new churches nationally. If you were to ask what is the number of new congregations founded in, say, the last 50 years in the UK, the short answer is we don't know. There is no OFRAL that gathers information on congregations in this country. We're reliant on people like the indefatigable researcher, Dr. Peter Brierley, whose work I would say is remarkable. I'm not sure I totally buy all of the figures. Don't hear me as criticizing Peter. I think he has done a remarkable job. And I recall him once saying in a seminar that he couldn't always swear to the figures, but he did trust the trends that they showed. And I would certainly go with that. So we can't estimate with any certainty the number of new churches started in the last 50 years. A detailed study of London suggests that around 2,000 new congregations have been founded in the capital in the last 40 years. Now, and that's the one area where I think there's more study than elsewhere. And so I'd see that number as certainly not certain, but it's approaching certainty. And I would say that 2,000 new congregations is a conservative estimate. It would be a reasonable estimate to say that there are between 5,000 and 10,000 new congregations founded in Britain since in the last 50 years. And the bulk of these remain in being. And if you were to ask me to guess, and frankly, there's no other way to do it at the moment, at a guess, I'd say there might be around 7,000 new congregations in the UK that were not there in, say, 1970, 1980. There weren't all that many being founded in the 70s, so the number hasn't gone up a lot. Now, 7,000 congregations, that's as much as the current number of Methodist and Baptist congregations added together. But those new congregations are better attended, younger on average, and far more ethnically diverse. These new churches are one of the most significant shifts in the recent history of British Christianity, and arguably the most significant shift in the last 50 years. So what can we say about baptisms in these new churches? And the first thing is to state the obvious, that if we are to write the recent history of baptism in the UK, we need to give serious attention to the new churches, because they are now such a large component of British church-going. And they are doing a lot of baptizing. They are not some fringe phenomenon. And they are also hugely diverse and poorly researched. So my generalized comments need to be heard with the recognition of the danger of generalizing. The survey of the northeast of England, which I've mentioned, was conducted in 2014 and 2015. It found 125 new churches which had been founded in that region since 1980. This survey asked these churches how many people they baptized. And from it, we estimate that the 125 new churches in the northeast baptized around 1,000 people in 2014. Of these, just over 10% were infants. The rest were what you might call believers' baptisms, where the person was either an adult or a child old enough to answer for themselves. And these baptisms tended to be concentrated in certain churches. These 1,000 baptisms, a large minority of the churches, these 125 churches, didn't baptize in the previous year. Conversely, a small number of new churches were highly baptismal, baptizing maybe 2 or 3 dozen in a year. Just over half of the new churches had baptized somebody in the previous 12 months. By comparison, the Anglican Diocese of Newcastle, these are figures for 2010, baptized a little over 2,000 children under the age of 12, and it baptized 130 people aged 13 or over. The Anglican Diocese of Durham in 2010 baptized just over 5,000 children under 12 and 310 people over the age of 13. Generally, Anglican baptism figures are dropping, so that's the comparison we've got there. That's to say, in 2010, Newcastle and Durham Diocese, which roughly covers what we would call the Northeast, baptized 440 people over the age of 12, which is probably under half the number that new churches baptized in a 12-month period. Conversely, far fewer, the new churches baptized vastly fewer numbers of infants or children under 12 and under. Sheila Okomiye-Conte's research on new churches in Glasgow, founded between 2000 and 2016, found, as I mentioned earlier, 110 new congregations in that city. By 2016, she estimates that they were baptizing around 400 people annually. The research did not uncover how many were children. However, most of the new churches came from traditions which would not baptize infants and small children and reserved baptism for older children and adults. Akomié Conte estimates that at least 90% of the baptized would be 16 or over. In both Glasgow and Northeast studies, baptism in new churches was mostly by immersion, which might involve temporary baptismal pools. Often there's a kind of sort of rent-a-baptistry industry, which has grown up in recent decades, where there may be one baptismal pool in a town and it does the rounds around different churches as they require it. Then again, hardier souls are getting baptized in rivers or in the sea. One of the, dare I say, one of the indicators that the River Wear in Durham has grown appreciably cleaner in recent decades is the fact that people are now being baptized in it. I remember going to university in Durham in the mid-1980s and being solemnly warned not to fall in because you'd have to go to hospital and have your stomach pumped. Mercifully, that's not the case, and the baptisms in it are an indicator of that. A question not asked in the Glasgow or Northeastern research is the extent to which people may have been baptized, already been baptized when they are baptized again in a new church. That is to say, people being baptized in one of these new churches may have been baptized as infants or even baptized by some other church at some earlier point. This kind of rebaptism may be happening either because the earlier baptism is seen as invalid, or because the idea of being baptized more than once is not seen as theologically problematic. Now, it's unclear how common such rebaptism is, but anecdotal evidence suggests it is happening to some degree. Reference has been made in this conference to the way theology and culture interplay in all kinds of ways within baptism. I recently talked to an Anglican vicar who was asked about the baptism of an infant by its father, and the father ended the conversation by asking, "Do you do circumcision?" Such an anecdote reminds us that the practice of baptism is changing in this country and meshing with wider notions of naming and initiation in ways which we at the moment understand all too little. A very different strand of new church life is orthodoxy. There has been a proliferation of Orthodox congregations in the UK in recent decades. Peter Briley estimates that there were around 130 Orthodox congregations in the UK in 1980, and that there are now around 360. That's a threefold increase, or almost a threefold increase. Data on baptisms by Orthodox is hard to come by, but evidence suggests that it's happening at a substantial rate, especially baptism of infants. Let me pull up a different slide. Here are baptisms. This comes from research by Robert Collins. Here are baptisms from the Moscow Patriarch's London Cathedral in Ennismore Gardens between 2011 and 2015, showing that around 500 baptisms a year were happening there. As a comparison, the Orthodox congregation in Durham City baptizes around 30 to 40 people each year, and in both cases, mostly infants. They're not exclusively infants. We don't know how many Orthodox baptisms are happening in the UK, but it's likely that that number is substantial and increasing. And here is baptism in Britain linked to an ecclesial identity, which in turn it strongly meshes with nationality, which is usually administered to young children. Now, most British Orthodox churches are new churches. You couldn't have gone to them 40, 50 years ago, but very different in character to the bulk of new churches in the UK. They represent a distinct but significant minority of new church baptisms in recent years. Now, the trajectory of orthodoxy in the UK may be affected in the future by changes in migration patterns due to Brexit. But it would be a mistake to assume that British orthodoxy is destined to plateau or even decline. The rapid rise of Coptic churches in the UK, which have doubled in number since 2005, is an indicator of the growing diversity of British orthodoxy and how it may well expand further in coming years. And here, if you will indulge me a second, I want to, as it were, take this sober academic conference in the direction of pub quiz and ask conference delegates if they can guess where this new Coptic cathedral, it's a new Coptic cathedral in Britain, and where it is located. And as you may be pondering that, I have to say to you, it personally delights me to announce that this is to be found, of all places, in Stevenage. I don't know about you, but Stevenage is not the first name that comes to mind as a centre of Coptic Christianity. Well, let's think about the wider picture for baptism. Jim, let me screen share again. What about the Church of England? Well, Church of England baptisms, that's all of them, in the last 20 years, tell a quite striking story. And you can see here, they have dramatically shrunk, almost halved between 2000 and 2019. And if we look at infants, the decline is even more striking. They have more than halved. If we look at data on Roman Catholicism, what we find is a decline, but not as steep. Now, since we cannot know the number of new church baptisms for certain, we can't therefore really say what is the overall number of baptisms in the UK in recent decades. It is very likely that the number of baptisms in the UK is declining overall. But within that decline, as you can see, there are very marked shifts. The historic denominations, especially the C of E, is seeing deep decline in baptismal practice. And whilst infant baptism remains significant, and in some regions of the country very significant, it is a fraction of its former self. At the same time, the rise of new churches is seeing a rise of baptisms by such churches. These are predominantly believers' baptisms, usually involving full immersion, but the growth of orthodoxy in Britain shows a vigorous new tradition of infant baptism that has arisen in recent years. Now, all the research I have cited was done prior to COVID. And I want, if you'll indulge me, to do a little exceedingly contemporary church history and ask what might be the likely impact of the pandemic on the very recent history of new churches. Well, obviously, the short answer is we don't know. But I want to throw out a few reflections. Like much of civil society, like, for instance, the arts and other cultural groups, Christian congregations have been hit very hard by COVID and subsequent lockdowns. There have been opportunities as well as burdens and restrictions, but I would see it as likely that a significant number of congregations will have shrunk. Some shrunk dramatically, and that some will not reopen. But the dynamics which were promoting new congregations in recent decades remain in play, notably significant in-migration into the UK, particularly from the global south. That needs balancing with a white British population, which is mainly continuing to secularize, but whose birth rate is also very low. And demographic change is a key driver to baptismal change. I'm going to come to my conclusions in a moment, but before that, I want to say a little about the idea of contemporary church history. In this conference, of the papers which cover the 20th century, the latest stopped in 1980. My experience is that this tendency to stop around 40 to 50 years before the present is often the case in historical study generally, and as well in ecclesiastical history. And in one sense, we could argue that we should leave recent decades to the sociologists and anthropologists. But I want to ask whether we ought to do history nearer to the present. And obviously, doing contemporary church history is problematic, entailing much conjecture, since the trends being evaluated are very far from having run their course. But the problematic nature of any periodization makes it very hard to determine at what point something becomes too close to the present that it ceases to count as history. Why stop at 1980 rather than 2000, for instance? Beyond that, it could be argued that the study of the very recent past is actively helpful to the overall task of ecclesiastical history. Certainly, the evaluation of recent past needs to be done with great caution, and the source material for writing contemporary church history, especially new churches, is often limited or slanted. Equally, the need for caution and the problem of defective source materials are hardly issues only for historians of the recent past. Conversely, even a cursory survey of the history of new churches in Britain shows that something of deep importance has happened in the last 50 years. I would see the grasping of the history of such congregations as being of huge value in making sense of new churches, and that both the academy and wider society urgently need to understand this phenomenon better. And that means we urgently need better recording of source materials, not least because many of the most dynamic new churches show, sadly, little concern to leave records of what they are doing. And one key reason why we urgently need to study these churches is that they are staggeringly diverse ethnically. They can reasonably claim to be the most diverse phenomenon in British society right now. This makes them not only fascinating, not only important for the trajectory of modern church history, but also of deep significance to wider society, especially in the febrile times in which we now live. Academia and wider society has had a fraught atmosphere over the past year about issues of ethnicity, inclusion, and decolonizing the curriculum. My guess is that in such debates, the value of church history is not often considered, but it should be. Study of contemporary British church history would enable recognition of the agency and voice of minority ethnic people within the church and in wider society. Church history has much to contribute to a historical profession and wider society, which is increasingly sensitized to ethnicity, but also sometimes deaf to the role of faith within history. Masses of new, often ethnically diverse churches have come into being in recent decades. Their history richly deserves study. Members and leaders of these churches have a considerable appetite for telling their their story and might be a rich source of future postgraduate and academic historians. Let me finish. If you go onto Google Image and put in baptism and Hyde Park, you will find images of people being baptized in the Serpentine. Here is, I think, a nice illustration of the way in which baptism is moving in recent decades. Large numbers of new churches have arisen in the UK in the recent past and have become a key component of British Christianity. New churches are vigorously baptismal and staggeringly diverse ethnically. That diversity is impacting the trajectory of baptism in recent decades. Whilst new church baptisms are predominantly of adults or older children, the rise of orthodoxy in the UK has meant the rise of a vigorous new tradition of infant baptism. Not so very long ago, the number of Anglican infant baptisms dwarfed the number of Orthodox infant baptisms in Britain. And the Anglicans continue to do a lot more for now, but the gap has closed significantly. Writing the contemporary church history of Britain has many challenges. But as a former resident of Durham, I cannot help noting that the Venerable Bede was happy to chronicle recent church history of his own day. And if that was good enough for Bede, should it not also be good enough for us?